Charles, obviously a really disappointing end to the session for you, considering the promise that this weekend has had so far for Ferrari. You just take us through.
What prospect then for the race tomorrow? Because it's a very mixed up top 10 right now. When you look at that, is there an opportunity there, or does it make it more challenging?
There is opportunity, but it's going to be tough to come back in the front anyway. But there's opportunity, and I'll obviously look forward and hopefully try and have a great Sunday with a disappointing Saturday. Normally it's been the other way around whenever I came here, so I'm looking forward to turn the situation around.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles.
How is it possible that a team that dominated practices ends humiliated in the classification? What secrets hides Ferrari's tragedy in Baku? And what impact will this blow to the rest of the season? Today I tell you the whole truth behind the worst Saturday of the year for Maranello. On Friday in Baku, the paddock of Formula One was filled with a feeling of palpable optimism. Ferrari, a team accustomed to expectations, had begun on the weekend of the Azerbaijan 2025 prize showing such a solid, so blunt way that even the most skeptical inside the paddock raised the eyebrow. In the second free training session, Lewis Hamilton, who barely disputed his third classification dressed in red, placed the SF25 at the top of the timetable. He recorded a 1:41,293, a clean, precise, aggressive turn at the fair point. A direct message for the rivals: Ferrari is here. Behind him, Charles Leclerc, the pilot who had made Baku his particular kingdom in the previous years, was located just 74 thousandths. That closeness not only reaffirmed that the car was working well, but for the first time both sides of the garage seemed synchronized. But the true element that fed the fire of illusion was not just the times. It was body language. Hamilton got out of the car with a slight smile, talking that the team had finally found technical direction, and that what learned in the first two races of the year began to crystallize in something tangible. Leclerc, on the other hand, did not hide his trust. Monegasco reached the GP with the possibility of extending its qualifying domain to 5 consecutive poles in Baku, a feat that would have placed it together with historical names such as Ayrton Senna or Michael Schumacher, at least in regard to supremacy in urban circuits. In Ferrari's box, engineers talked about balance. The SF25 had demonstrated good traction in slow curves, efficiency in lines, and a neutral behavior that allowed him to adapt well to the Azeri asphalt, known for its low adhesion surface and aggressive braking areas. For the first time in a long time, Ferrari arrived at Saturday without excuses. The car was ready, the pilots in shape, and the clear strategy. But this is where the story begins to break. Because in Formula One, the difference between a promise and a tragedy can be just 24 hours. On Friday he had not exposed the true weaknesses of SF25. It was a mirage built on ideal conditions: optimal temperature, clean traffic, and laps thrown with little stress in the energy system. On Saturday everything changed. The asphalt temperature dropped. The wind intensified in the most open areas of the circuit, particularly affecting cars with sensitive balance. And there, in that little mismatch, the SF25 began to reveal its true face. A fast car, yes, but fragile, inconsistent, dependent on a perfect scenario to shine. The rivals noticed him. In data analysis, McLaren and Mercedes saw that Ferrari needed more thrust turns to generate heat in the tires. While other teams managed to put their compounds at optimal temperature in the first attempt, the SF25 required an extra lap. And in classification, that detail is lethal. Because there is not always time for a warm-up return. And if there is, rarely traffic or conditions allow it. Thus, what had been a dream Friday became a previous disaster. But nobody knew it yet. The cameras continued to focus on Ferrari as a favorite. The commentators took it for granted. But inside the box, the smiles began to tense. The monitors showed that the car needed more than I could receive. The pressure rose. And on Saturday, the clock ran in the opposite direction. When the Azerbaijan 2025 Grand Prix began, expectations about Ferrari could not be higher. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc arrived with the conviction that Friday's work was going to translate into solid results. But it all began to crumble silently, almost imperceptible at the beginning, as a structure that crosses before collapsing. The first alarm signal came in Q1, where Ferrari already showed signs of tension. Although both pilots spent too many shocks, radio communications began to reflect concern. Hamilton was the first to raise my voice. I have no grip back. He is unstable in each braking. A short phrase, but that encapsulated a whole world of technical problems. What was being evident was an erratic behavior in the rear of the SF25, product of poor thermal management in the tires. Ferrari, who has historically struggled with this type of inconsistencies, seemed to have inherited in 2025 a chassis very sensitive to the operating window of the Pirelli compounds. When the tire was at its point, the car flew. But there was a small fall in temperature or a change in the wind direction so that the car became unpredictable, especially in high loading areas such as curves 8 and 15 of Baku. And the worst was yet to come. In Q2, Lewis Hamilton suffered his 5th elimination in this phase in just 3 races. A data as raw as revealing. The adaptation of 7 times champion to SF25 was being much slower than anyone in Maranello expected. Its piloting style with late braking and aggressive rotation of the rear did not finish coupling with the delivery of aerodynamic load of the car. While other pilots took performance in the first launch turn, Hamilton needed more preparation, more temperature, more confidence. But in classification there is no space for that. The frustration was evident. Not only for elimination but for context. A day before, Hamilton had led the timetable. How do you go from the top to the abyss in 24 hours? That is the question that Ferrari could not answer. Neither on the radio, nor in the subsequent briefings. And that is where the emotional relationship between pilot and machine begins to break. Hamilton, for the first time this season, showed that gesture that we have seen so much in his career when something goes wrong. Silence. The type of silence that bothers. He who says more than 1,000 words. But if Hamilton was a painful fall, what happened with Charles Leclerc was directly a sports tragedy. The Monegasco was in Q3, looking for its 5th consecutive pole in Baku. A milestone that would have registered its name among the great specialists of an urban circuit. It came in a quick lap, with the car apparently under control when it entered curve 15, that blind spot between walls, one of the most technical and trend of the calendar. You wore too much speed. Maybe because I needed to find those last tenths to keep the pole. Perhaps because the self-imposed pressure of maintaining his reign in Baku clouded his trial. The truth is that the car did not respond. Subviro blocked the front axle and went straight against the wall. He hit hard, destroying the front suspension. The car was crossed, motionless as a symbol of a broken dream in real time. Leclerc came out on his own foot, but his body language said everything. He threw the gloves to the ground, removed his helmet without looking at anyone and lowered his head. For a pilot who had made this circuit his strength, that error was not just a piloting failure. It was a personal, emotional, symbolic defeat. At that time, the entire narrative of the weekend collapsed. The Ferrari that seemed to contend for pole was left without pilots in the fight for the front row. One out in Q2. Another star in Q3. But the most alarming was not the accident. It was the inability of the team to anticipate it. To prevent it. To warn the pilot that the conditions had changed, that the grip had lowered, that the risk was unnecessary. What happened in Baku was, apparently, a bad classification. A Saturday failed like so many others. But just look under the surface to discover that it was not simply an isolated stumbling block. It was a raw manifestation without filters of a deeper problem that Ferrari has failed to solve for years. The structural disconnection between the potential of the car, the performance under pressure and the decision-making within the wall. One of the most serious weaknesses of the SF25 is its extremely narrow operational window. Unlike cars such as McLaren MCL39, which can adapt to track conditions with surprising flexibility, Ferrari's car requires that everything is exactly in place to work. Track temperature, tire pressure, aerodynamic configuration, lateral balance. Any deviation from the optimal point makes the car an unpredictable animal. And that is a gigantic problem in modern Formula One, where on weekends they are increasingly compressed. The conditions change from one minute to the other, and the margins are smaller than ever. A leading team cannot afford such a sensitive car. Because what seems like an advantage in simulations becomes a lethal weakness on Saturday afternoon. In addition, there is the human factor. In Baku, it was clear that communication between engineers and pilots was not effective. Neither Hamilton nor Leclerc received clear warnings about the evolution of the track. They were not adapted an effective tire heating strategy. And above all, no problems were corrected that were already visible from Q1. And this leads us to the psychological plane. Because when a pilot like Hamilton with 7 world titles is caught in a car that does not respond and a team that does not solve, mental wear is inevitable. The British arrived in Maranello hungry with motivation, with the promise to build something big. But each failed session is a crack in that narrative. Each elimination in Q2 is an emotional fracture that, in the long term, charges invoice. In the case of Leclerc, the problem is even more delicate. Because it is not only the flagship pilot of the team, but also who has loaded with Ferrari's emotional weight for many years. Baku was his circuit. your place of authority. Losing that streak, in addition to your own mistake, can be devastating for your trust. And without trust, a pilot does not yield. So simple. And the most disturbing is what this could mean for the rest of the calendar. Because if the team fails to stabilize the performance of the SF25 on unpredictable weekends such as Baku, then it is only a matter of time for the pattern to be repeated. And in a year with 20-4 great awards, losing confidence in key Saturdays not only subtracts points, you can cost entire championships. In addition, we cannot ignore the human impact. Lewis Hamilton did not come to Ferrari to build from scratch. He came to win. Fast. Every failed weekend is a silent leakage of motivation. And Charles Leclerc, despite his emotional fidelity to the rampant Cavallino, is not immune to the wear of loading with a structure that does not respond in decisive moments. And now I ask you a direct question. Do you think Ferrari still has room to reverse this scenario? Or are we witnessing the beginning of another cycle of frustrations as in previous seasons? Leave me your opinion in the comments.